Whiskey in the United States is a multi-billion-dollar industry, with a history as long as the nation itself. Whiskey and other such spirituous liquors have a long and often contradictory history. Those in America, the land of contradictions, has characteristically not made things simple with whiskey. Once a way for farmers to transport grains from the hinterlands and frontiers to the cities while maintaining their value, to an everyday staple blamed for every ill in society, to banned outright and driven underground before making a hard-fought return to polite society, now re-emerging as a highfalutin craft. Whiskey was, and remains, an important part of American society, and is as simple as those that make, regulate, and consume it. Production of distilled alcohol is nearly as old as agriculture itself, with ancient Akkadian tablets describing distillation for use in perfumes. The mechanism by which alcohol is produced is very simple. Sugars are consumed by the microscopic fungi yeast, specifically Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which excrete alcohol and carbon dioxide. The source for these sugars is only limited by the imagination, though specifically in whiskey, you break down the carbohydrates from various grains into the usable sugars you need, in effect creating a beer called mash. If you then heat that mash to about 200 degrees Fahrenheit, the alcohol begins to evaporate, separating it from the water and other things in the mash. Should you have a proper still, the alcohol vapor will begin to collect on the inside of the condenser before dripping out to be collected. The main limitation to early distillation was in still technology. You could only get a weak distillate using the air-cooled terracotta stills in use across the Old World from Egypt to China. It wasn't until the Islamic Golden Age and the advent of water-cooled condensers would stills be able to produce highly pure alcohol. These techniques would slowly work their way out of the Islamic world and across Europe via the secretive alchemist societies. The word alcohol coming from Arabic, hence the al prefix, through medieval Latin, finally ending up in English. Alchemists, looking to make money so they could keep licking random materials, often plied their trades to those with the need. Some of the oldest distillation operations were for brandy, the distillations of fruit wines. Brandy coming from brandy wine, basically meaning burnt wine. The string of events connecting the Old World alchemists to the massive distilleries of America comes through the insular Christian monasteries of Ireland and Scotland, who preserved the practice of distillation for medical purposes. In medieval Britain, the earliest mentions of whiskey comes from the annals of Clonmacnoise, a 17th century translation of a 15th century history of Ireland written at the monastery of the same name in County Offaly. The author blames the death of Richard Magranel, chieftain of the Moyntai Rolas, who died on Christmas 1405 by taking a surfeit of Aqua Vitae, commenting, "Mine author saith that it was not Aqua Vitae, to him, but Aqua Mortis." Ha ha. The Scots also had a liking for this water of life, with the exchequer rolls of the King of Scotland James III noting an expense to the friar John Core, malt enough for 500 bottles. His son John IV too liked the water of life, granting the Guild of Barber Surgeons in Dundee a monopoly on the production of whiskey in 1506. These early whiskies would not have been aged and more resembled moonshine than the Scotch of today. That said, the invention of barrel aging was likely incidental to moving liquor from one place to another and forgetting it for a few years before realizing, hey, that's pretty good. It also took some time before people diluted whiskey, so whatever proof it was off the spout is what you got. The English colonization of America and the development of the early whiskey industry took place in roughly the same time frame. Among the first colonists of Virginia was the Gloucestershire-born Member of Parliament and lawyer George Thorpe, who decided to go to Virginia in order to oversee his investment in the colony. Thorpe worked closely with the local Powhatans, even building an English-style house for their principal chief, Opechancanough. Thorpe was invested in a tract of land called the Berkeley Hundred, encompassing modern-day Charles City, County, Virginia. Thorpe was interested in making the colony a viable place to live, planting grapes, planning a college that would one day be the College of William and Mary, as well as experimenting with local crops, namely corn. Thorpe was the first to produce whiskey from corn, Virginia as his fellow settlers called it. After Thorpe was killed by the Powhatans he had tried to befriend in the Indian Massacre of 1622, his estate was itemized to pay the debts he left, mostly incurred from building the house for Chief Opechancanough. Among his effects were a copper still and 3 runs of Virginia, which were drank by those doing the itemizing. From there, the practice of distillation continued and evolved. By the middle of the 18th century, distilleries were a feature on many of the larger plantations of Virginia. George Washington famously erected a large distillery on the grounds of Mount Vernon, producing a whiskey with a mash bill of 60% rye, 35% corn, and 5% malted barley. While whiskey was important to the early American farmer, especially further west where it would be harder to bring grain to market, rum was still the king of liquor in America until well into the 19th century. In the early Republic, the center of whiskey production was the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains of Pennsylvania and Virginia. The principal producers of whiskey in these locales were of Scotch-Irish descent, the fiercely independent and often violent people from the Anglo-Scots border and Ulster Plantation that is today Northern Ireland. The nascent federal government, desperate for income to pay off their massive war debts accrued during the Revolution, decided that the importation duties, which were largely their only source of income, weren't enough. Alexander Hamilton proposed an excise on domestically produced alcohol of 6 cents per gallon, the majority being whiskey. This tax was the first of such taxes levied on a domestically produced product, and passed into law March 1791, and was in effect by November. When the news reached the back country, the tax was immediately highly controversial, to put it lightly. In western Pennsylvania, whiskey was much like tobacco was in Virginia, a relatively standard, easy-to-transport, and useful store of value in a time where money, particularly hard currencies of gold or silver, were hard to come by. Some, primarily religious types, approved of the duty, calling it a sin tax. The farmers of the new frontier, particularly those on the western side of the Appalachian Mountains, were disproportionately affected, due primarily to the added transport costs associated with getting their product to market. The already ornery people of this American frontier were, by July 27, 1791, organizing a resistance against the tax. Meeting initially at Old Redstone Fort, now the borough of Brownsville south of Pittsburgh on the Monongahela, the Pennsylvanians put together a delegation to send to Philadelphia, then the capital of both Pennsylvania and the United States, seeking a redress of grievances. The situation worsened by September of that year when tax collectors were attacked across the backcountry, the tax going largely uncollected from Georgia to Pennsylvania. While low-level violence was common, things escalated when a tax collector was tarred and feathered in Washington County, Pennsylvania, the night before the formal delegation met in nearby Pittsburgh. The next August in 1792, a second delegation began discussing the tax once again in Pittsburgh, and was altogether more radical in tone. The moderates that had attended last year were absent. Soon thereafter, militias began to form in the face of the September tax season. One such group, the Mingo Creek Association, dominated the radical factions, issued demands to the federal government, and toured the backcountry raising liberty poles and riling up the frontiersmen. I'm going to skip over the actual rebellion and come back later to give it a proper video, but the story, as most of you may well know, is the whiskey-producing farmers, primarily western Pennsylvania, took up arms in opposition to the tax. After a low-level round of insurgency, the Pennsylvanians rose up and were met by federal troops. Only after a proper federal army entered western Pennsylvania did things quiet down. Warrants for the leaders of the rebellion were issued, but only 10 were captured and tried. Only 2, Philip Wiggle and John Mitchell, were actually convicted and sentenced to hang. Wiggle for burning a collector's house, and Mitchell for robbing the postal service. Both were pardoned by President Washington, though others were convicted of lesser crimes at the state level. Resistance to the tax continued under President Thomas Jefferson, and Congress voted to repeal the tax in 1802. As per the federal regulators, there are 6 main types of American whiskey, all of them depending on the primary ingredient of the mash bill. Rye, malt, and wheat must contain at least 51% of their named ingredient. Bourbon must contain at least 51% corn, but corn whiskey must contain at least 80% corn. While not all whiskeys are aged in barrels, legally in the United States to be called whiskey, the liquor must be aged in barrels. Bourbon is the only one with the stipulation that it must be aged in charred new white oak barrels. A notable exception is corn whiskey, which doesn't have to be aged, or if it is, aged in used or uncharred barrels. If that corn whiskey were to go into a charred new white oak barrel, it would be a bourbon, unless that corn whiskey was run through maple charcoal, but we'll get to that in a bit. In the 19th century, whiskey, usually bourbon, suffered from adulteration, leading to the Bottled and Bond Act of 1897. To be labeled as bonded, the whiskey must be produced by one single distillery, aged in a secure, federally inspected bonded warehouse for at least 4 years, and be bottled at 100 proof, 50% AVB, and the bottles must display all relevant information to the process. While the bonding process was originally intended for bourbon, rye and corn whiskey can also be bonded, in addition to another popular American liquor, the apple brandy Applejack. Whiskey that isn't aged in barrels is colloquially known as moonshine, and while not all moonshine is whiskey, all whiskey is moonshine unless the tax man knows about it. Moonshining is as old as whiskey production itself. Before better transportation and industrial distillation processes allowed for farmers to sell grain to distillers, the distillers were the farmers, and should a few barrels or bottles escape the notice of the tax collector, many of the first distilleries were operated by farmers who had a reputation for their whiskey and simply beat out local competition and used that money to upgrade their facilities. Jasper Newton Jack Daniel, while not a farmer, honed his craft working for the preacher, landowner, and distiller Dan Call. Jack learned primarily from Call's slave and master distiller Nathan Nearest Green, who specialized in the Lincoln County process, what sets Tennessee whiskey apart from the very similar bourbons of Kentucky. In the Lincoln County process, the young whiskey, before being moved into barrels, is either run through, as in Jack Daniel's version, or steeped in a vat containing, in George Dickel's version, charcoal made from specifically sugar maple. With the passage of the Volstead Act in 1919, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution passed, with Congress even overriding President Woodrow Wilson's veto. The 18th Amendment banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of beverages with an alcohol by volume higher than 0.5%, making not only distilled liquors but beer and wine illegal as well. The passage of Prohibition was devastating for American alcohol across the board. So much of the knowledge and technique were lost and couldn't recover even after the act was repealed. Now, looking specifically at spirits, there were some exploitable loopholes. The amendment had a grandfather clause stating that so long as you had a proof of purchase dated before the amendment went into effect, you could possess however much liquor you wanted. Now, if you were the honest sort, it is possible to have hoarded enough to last you the entire 13 years of Prohibition, but, as I see it, if you were to refill empty bottles, perhaps purchased by some sort of local small business, while retaining your old receipts, who's to say you didn't already have that? While industrialization of alcohol production made it less profitable for you to make your own whiskey, the traditions and knowledge did not perish from the Scots-Irish, and when Prohibition killed the large industrial producers, a craft industry, so to speak, revived. These moonshiners used either mobile stills, breaking the still down and moving from hiding spot to hiding spot, or extremely well-hidden still sites deep in the Appalachian Mountains, or even in some cases, hiding in urban areas. Those moonshiners in the hinterlands employed a relatively new invention, the mass-produced automobile, better known as the car. These cars were piloted by bootleggers. As the police were also on the car train, an arms race between bootleggers seeking a big payday in Depression America and police enforcing the will of the state ensued in a cat-and-mouse fashion, famously evolving after the end of Prohibition into stock car racing. The center of whiskey production in North America transitioned from the United States to Canada, which had no such prohibition and is right there, leading to something of a new export market for Canadian whiskey. The only real difference between Canadian and American whiskeys is instead of diversifying the grain in the mash bill, Canadian whiskeys are blended from multiple distillations of specific grain whiskeys. So instead of changing the percentage in the mash, the Canadians tend to make runs consisting of high percentages of rye, corn, or wheat and blend them together at the end. During American Prohibition, Gooderham and Worts, the world's largest producer of whiskey, merged with Hiram Walker and Sons, who produced the Canadian Club brand of whiskey in Windsor, Ontario, directly across the Detroit River from the now forcibly dry American city of Detroit. The main purveyors of illegal liquor, particularly whiskey, were large criminal organizations, specifically the largest ethnic mob of a particular area. The Italian mafia became ascendant in this time period, leveraging their wide-ranging connections and deep pool of out-of-work Italians to move monumental amounts of alcohol into the cities. These bottles ended up in mafia-controlled speakeasies, clandestine clubs where alcohol was served at a markup appropriate to the legal climate. After the 18th Amendment was repealed by the passage of the 21st Amendment on December 5, 1933, whiskey producers did have somewhat of an easier time rebuilding than beer producers, with much of their products simply locked away in bottles or barrels. So long as they weren't destroyed, they could easily start selling again to regain cash flow. Some companies actually continued to produce whiskey after the passage of Prohibition, with Brown-Forman, Frankfurt Distilleries, the A.P.H. Stitzel Distillery, the American Medicinal Spirits Company, Shenley Industries, and James Thompson and Brother being licensed to produce for medicinal purposes, something, yes, you could get a prescription for. Those that continued through Prohibition were at an obvious advantage, with Brown-Forman, Frankfurt, and APH Stitzel all operating today, with their flagship products being Jack Daniel's, Buffalo Trace, and Old Pappy Van Winkle, respectively, among other big names at your local liquor store. Whiskey maintained its popularity through the Second World War and for some time after that, though began running into problems as the massive baby boomer generation began dominating the market. Whiskey had a reputational problem among the me generation, who rebelled against the previous generations, preferring cocktails mixed with relatively neutral vodkas or gins over the strongly present bourbons and ryes, what they considered something only their dads drank. Whiskeys, and particularly bourbon, struggled against this reputation. It took decades for people to return to and begin appreciating whiskey again. Since about the late aughts or very early 2010s, whiskey has entered something of a renaissance. Not just for the big producers either. The number of American craft distilleries producing whiskey has increased from only 76 in 2006 to over 2,200 in 2024, per the American Distilling Institute. Barring some unforeseen event, the market cap for American whiskey is conservatively projected to increase by the end of this decade about 10%. Once popular but previously lost types of whiskey, like rye, have gone from all but extinct in the 1990s to presently displayed on shelves and in upscale cocktail bars everywhere in the country, signaling the health of the craft. Even white whiskeys, marketed as moonshine, have had a revival in recent years, with popular TV shows about moonshiners and moonshine production inspiring many on the internet to get into the hobby whiskey craft, synergizing with the maturing home brewing hobby and craft beer industry. While some things, like domestically produced single malt Scotch competitors, have, as far as I'm aware, remained out of reach, the continued revival and recovery of not only the American whiskey heritage lost during Prohibition, but its accompanying cocktail expertise is a great step in the right direction for this lost section of American culture. Thank you for watching or just listening. If you could leave a like and subscribe to Mid-Atlantic Chronicles, that would be much appreciated. Thank you again.